Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to the Black Republican Theory. This is Terry Greet, your host. So, on today's show, we're going to go over critical race theory. I know that you have, heard about critical race theory over the past year and a half, unless you've been living under a rock, quite frankly. But many people have not explained what critical race theory is. And so critical race theory, came into the American mainstream in the spring of 2021, really in the summer of 2020, in response to a tweet and many of the efforts that Trump was speaking about regarding the 1619 project and what he ended up calling the 1776 commission, which really showed like it was ultimate, type of vanilla response. But what he was trying to say was that in America, our American history starts at 1776, not at 1619. Although in 1619, that's when, the first slaves came to the American colonies. Now, I would argue, as you might be able to see from the flag in my background, that, the 13 stripes on the American flag represent the 13 original colonies. And we have to embrace that history. Now, what we see happening in the media, is a critical analysis of, what has happened in our history as Americans and how that shapes and plays into the present day. And that's how the 1619 project came about. And in response to the 1619 project and all the race talk, came the 1776 Commission. Uh, why is race talk, etc., important to uh, Americans? Well, why? Because there's a rural urban divide on almost everything. There's a rural urban divide, and the way that we see different things in our rural urban divide has a reflection and an impact on how we vote. And really, this is just about winning elections, guys. It's about winning elections. We have become divided along so many lines that we cannot continue to function and operate in a true way that would bring about lasting and substantive change. Well, leading up to the 2021 elections in both New Jersey and in Virginia, which were highly publicized, you had a guy named Christopher Rufo. And Mr. Rufo works for the Manhattan Institute. He's also a journalist, etc. He sent out a tweet saying, "Hey, here's what critical race theory, here's what it is in your schools, and why we need to fight it." Now, what he's actually talking about when he talks about critical race theory is the response to diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts that are in these schools. Diversity is, they're talking about the different people, cultures, things. Inclusion are the different, how, including those different people, cultures, things into and bringing them into the fold, the conversation, the institution, considering their perspective. And then lastly, equity is guaranteeing that there's an equal outcome or parity of outcomes for the different groups. The problem is that this does not consider the input, if you will, how much effort you put in versus another group. Now, my analysis today, or my lesson for the day, is not to so much go over critical race theory in the context of the elections, because yes, that's important. My lesson for today is going to talk about what critical race theory is, and my qualifications are is that or are my JD from law school, and literally just having taken the critical legal studies or critical legal theory class. Now, critical race theory is a subset of critical legal theory. And what critical legal theory is really just like a analysis, or in most simplistic terms, is analysis of power dynamics within the law. Okay? Power dynamics within the law. Now, this came about through, yes, it has Marxist origins. That's being from Karl Marx and the guy who wrote, the Communist Manifesto, but that's just lazy thinking. He stayed over there in Germany. There are guys who brought that line of thinking over to Columbia University here in the United States. And when they did so, they came up with the critical legal studies and critical legal theory subset subsection. But towards the 1970s, you had people like Derek Brooks and Kimberly Crenshaw, who was brilliant, by the way, and she's brilliant in her own right, who came up with, I mean, Derek Bell, I'm sorry, not Derek Brooks, Derek Bell. Uh, they came up with critical race theory. Now, critical race theory is the study of race and power dynamics in the law. You see how that is different from talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion? It's completely different. When you talk about this, studying power dynamics of race and power and the law. Now, when we talk about critical race theory, we have to go to the different forms of um, what some would call the different forms of racism. They have what they call substantive racism and procedural racism. Now, substantive racism is, essentially one group is not equal to the other. That's it. Procedural racism is creating rules that may uh, detriment one group versus another. So, for example, if you have, I just mentioned that I'm in law school. There's studies out there that say that the LSAT is racist because it takes, some Black individuals have a harder time getting high scores on the LSAT as opposed to people from other groups. But that does not take in, again, the flaw in all this thinking is that it doesn't take into either, number one, the efforts that people put into studying for the LSAT, affording prep classes, and of other forms of action that or efforts that they might have put in to studying. But let's just stick with the lesson. So yes, you have substantive racism and procedural racism. And so to give you an example is that, I just gave you an example of procedural. Substantive racism would just be saying, oh, hey, you're not as good as this other group for whatever reason, and that's it. So, in order to analyze these things, you have different tests. Okay. The first test that you have is the cultural meaning test. In other words, what does XYZ mean to what group? Okay. Um, when you're asking what does something mean to one group, you want to look at, just different things that are happening out in society. You might take, for example, back when the Washington football team, NFL team, was named the Redskins, right? So, if you take that, you'll say, well, is there a history of discrimination? That will be uh, the first question. Is there a history of discrimination? Is there a history of discrimination? Yeah, there is a history of discrimination. The history of discrimination there are the cultural appropriation, and um, violence against Native American Indians, right? So no one can deny that there has been a cultural appropriation or violence against Native American groups. I mean, literally, when the Europeans first took step on the American continent, they had individuals here and they started to slaughter them, right, and attack them. And when they did attack them, they, and these people would turn red for blood and everything. They would call them Redskins, right? And so we move on to say, well, how recent is this history? Well, considering that the United States is 200, so I think 30, 40 years old, and um, 230 or 40 years old, and Native Americans have still faced violence up until even the 1900s, but they're still having their land taken from them. I mean, look at Standing Rock, and everything that was happening out there. Even the Obama girls had to get involved with that one. Um, this is a pretty recent history, and I think that was what 2014, 2015 that was happening. That's pretty significant, and that's pretty recent. And so this is an ongoing problem. And so, you know, we then look at, well, which group is being impacted? Well, Native Americans. Well, what does it mean for them? Is there disparate impact on them? Yes, because it is mostly affecting them. And so you would say, well, is this racist towards the Native Americans? Yes, the name is racist towards Native Americans. That's the cultural meaning test. Another tool that we might use is the subordination question. And what the subordination question says is essentially, and I'm looking at my notes here, guys. The subordination question says, subordination question, is one race negatively affected or not? Well, if we look at, say Brown versus Board of Education, for example, in Brown v. Board, you had only one group that was saying, hey, it's separate but equal resources, and truth be told, it was not separate. I mean, it was separate, but it was not equal resources. Black folk were getting hand me down books from white school districts and white neighborhoods and the neighboring white schools, and so they face that type of discrimination, etc. And so we're going to look at Brown v. Board of Education. Now, when we talk about Brown v. Board of Education, this was decided in 1954. And essentially, what happened in that case was that you had a father out in Topeka, Kansas. That's and his last name is Brown, but he sued the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, and he said, hey, and it was several lawsuits from different states, but the Supreme Court lumped them all together and did for lack of better words in layman's terms, a bulk decision, right? They did an omnibus decision to cover all of these cases all at once. And it was essentially saying, hey, yes, there is racism in these schools because you have black people who are not only getting under resourced schools and materials, but they are also, feeling inferior and they're being made to feel inferior because of these lack of resources, etc. So, who was being subordinated in that situation? Well, that really calls into question the power dynamics of it all. If you have white folks and white school districts over here and black folks and black school districts over here, and one group is getting the better materials, et cetera, and the other group is not, then that kind of answers your question for you, right? The last tool to analyze um, critical race theory is actually a theory or an analysis is called entrance convergence test. And essentially, what it says is, did a change or will a change happen when power the empowered group needs something? To rephrase that and to state it a different way is, how does this dominant group benefit in the change that will benefit the subordinated group? And so if we look back at Brown versus Board of Education, what was happening during this time? You had the Cold War. You just had the Korean War, right? And what we saw happening is that we also had proxy wars against communism, okay? And we were trying to say, USA, 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 America is great, right? Because America is great. I mean, considering the ideas and everything that we have here, right? Well, what this was saying was essentially, if we take it back to Brown v. Board of Education, right? Is saying that the Supreme Court unanimously decided to change racial segregation laws in the United States, not because Thurgood Marshall was an awesome orator and person and litigator, not because of the overwhelming evidence presented by the NAACP and other groups, but that the law actually changed because on the global stage, America was being shown up by our adversaries because of segregation. And because of the segregation and racial disparities, our adversaries was using racial disparities as a criticism to the United States. So, guys, I want to go over something, right? When Brown versus Board of Education was decided in 1954-55, schools were segregated. And schools are still segregated. Although there is no de jure or by law, which is Latin for by law, segregation, there is still overwhelming segregation, and it's largely based on number one, proximity and where people live. We have more racial segregation by choice lines now, um, and really based on the lines of economics, okay, and lines of income and home values in some school districts are overwhelmingly higher because it's a reinforced cycle of that. Now, that is a subject for a different video. For this video today, I just wanted to go over what critical race theory was and the tools of analysis that you can use to study and understand critical race theory. And so if we continue to the next slide and we talk about some of these diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, you'll have things like, for example, this. At Tulane University, a medical school, I think it's actually in Louisiana, right? You have a black doctor who essentially wanted to make um, the school and teaching about the medical field more inclusive. It is fact that, and you see this word equity, it is fact that people of different racial groups experience different racial um, outcomes based on the understandings and what has been taught in our country about race. And this is really just a carryover from like slavery and the eugenics area. Actually, I have a book. This book right here is called Medical Apartheid by Harriet Washington. And she really discusses these things. And she goes over basically how race continues to affect different individuals and their medical situations, etc. And what we should be doing as a country is trying to get past these racial divides so that the racial outcomes will be relatively the same based on us putting forward equal effort. Instead, what you have is a country where we're so racially divided among so many lines. You have the mouthpiece of conservatism, which is just a statement and that's not meant to be a criticism, but the most popular media network. Sorry for the noise in the background. Work being done on my house. Where they're criticizing some of the medical schools because they're teaching more diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, right? And this really becomes a challenge because we as Americans, yes, race is important, but it should not be the end all be all. Race should not be something, we're too divided along the lines of race in this country. We need to bring ourselves together. We need to learn how to work together. And really, I remember this time, um, studying in history where both parties wanted to make sure that everyone receives equal treatment and equal outcome. And we've lost that in this country. I hope that we can bring it back. And so when you have doctors just trying to say, when you have doctors, excuse me for a second. When you have doctors who are promoting diversity, equity, inclusion efforts into their schools and into their hospitals, we want to make sure that we can continue to embrace those efforts, but in a healthy way. If embracing those efforts means more division, we have to ask ourselves, well, what is the cause of that division? What is the angst around that division? In some cases, it's been proven by many institutions and think tanks and whatnot, including Harvard, including the Pew Research Center. A lot of that goes right back to either racism or anxiety. And really that is based on misunderstood notions based on who you have proximity to and who you have proximity with. I can tell you there are communities around America where race, while it is there, it almost does not exist because they're colorblind communities. And these are particularly in rural, rural or lower income communities where you have different racial groups interacting with each other. Take, for example, you take Dundalk or you take Northwest Baltimore, where yes, you have different races, but they are more so working together because they are in such close proximity together. Look at North Carolina and some of the things that's happening down there. When you are in close proximity to a different racial group, you learn to work together. And that's what we really need to start doing here in our country. And so, really, guys, the video for today was to go over what critical race theory is, go over that analysis. I was a little bit thrown off by the noise that I had going on in the background. I will probably film a better video, more substantive video later, substantive video later, and probably replace this one. But for now, thank you.